Hey everybody, I'm Alex Sharastani. I'm the founder of the Journal of Law and Technology at Texas. Welcome to Blockchain Basics, and thanks to the Blockchain Graduate Society at McCombs for joining us. To my left we have Brian Hall. He's an attorney with Traverse Legal. Mira Ganor, who's a professor at UT Law of Business Associations and Venture Capital, and then Brian Conradi, who's also an attorney, but he has his own blockchain company. So let's welcome them all really quick. Have a seat?
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you who haven't been here before, we like to have a really participatory discussion. So instead of saving questions for the end, if you have a pressing question, please raise your hand and I'll try and get to you if there's a natural break in the conversation. With that, let's get started. So everyone's talking about blockchain technology, and what we really hear about is Bitcoin. Bitcoin, it sounds like, is money for money's sake. But I've come to understand that there's really a platform thing going on here. Can you guys explain a little bit about what blockchain actually does?
Sure. How shall we? Would you, Brian, like to? Yeah. What blockchain actually does? Well, that's a broad question. I've seen some great TED talks and things like that. They're really brilliant at answering that in a concise period of time. So maybe I'll just answer what blockchain is for me and how I kind of digest blockchain.
Yeah.
I think that there are two key parts of blockchain that get a lot of people excited. That's the decentralized aspect of it. So blockchain allows things that are centralized to be done in a new decentralized way, and that doesn't sound like it's revolutionary on its surface, but when you drill down, it can really change a lot of the ways that we conduct our societies.
Mm-hmm.
And then the immutable aspect of the transaction recordings is another aspect of what blockchain allows. That allows for transparency and trust at a new level that we've never had before. So blockchain to me is a way of recreating so many things that we do in society in a new way of trust and a new level of trust and a new way of decentralizing, democratizing, pushing out decisions and processes to groups instead of centralized organizations. So that at its core, and in the way I digest blockchain is what I see as such a big potential for the future.
Yeah, I mean, what I like to say is, I like to define it by what it is not, right? Blockchain is not Bitcoin. Blockchain is not cryptocurrency. Blockchain is the underlying technology that enables a lot of these things to happen, a lot of these transactions that are being contemplated, a lot of these companies that are developing new and interesting ways of doing something, right? But what I see blockchain as right now is it's the magic word that attracts people like you into this room. It attracts investors to companies that float the fact that they're on the blockchain. It is the sexiest term in society right now, in my opinion.
And let me just add that what it is, basically, this technology actually is a database, decentralized, secure, as you said. You can think about it, as many think about it, as a digital ledger, and that's why it facilitates all of these wonderful new potential applications, which really has nothing to do with Bitcoin, which is just the best first attempt of using it.
So you guys, Brian, you had discussed the trust involved. We had discussed a little bit about ICOs. So with ICOs, you hear a lot about scams. You hear a lot about this open ledger, but you also hear about privacy and people running off with millions of dollars. So how can there be both privacy and transparency? And how does that translate into successful ICOs, which are initial coin offerings? That's where a company will fund their project through an initial sale of their tokens. So if we could talk a little bit about that. So I know your company does verification of ICOs. Can you describe a little bit what the problem is that you're trying to solve?
Sure. I suppose just a bit of background about myself. So I'm a lawyer. I've got a practice that involves international transactions of one way or another. We do private equity, just 12 of us. We have an office in Moscow, Russia, which is a big blockchain center these days, and of course here as well. So just a small outfit, and it was a few months ago, back in the middle of 2017, that we were asked several times to advise in an ICO, and after having followed it on the periphery, decided let's go ahead and do our best to advise these people on what's happening. So we got an ICO through our law practice. We started from the beginning all the way to the end. It was a company called Crypto 20 that raised approximately $40 million and on a global offering, and we just were kind of shocked at what we were seeing in the trenches. And we decided that we'd take a step back and kind of drill down on the ecosystem. We got in a conference room, and just the core team that was doing this advisory work really looked at how it worked. And at its core, we decided there were some fundamental flaws with ICOs, that being accountability. People are raising all these funds on the backs of promises, and there's no way to know whether they'll follow through on those promises. So we decided that we'd start a company called Increment that actually at its core works to solve this accountability problem. And we're just simply using escrow and inserting it into the ICO process, and allows the investors to control the release of funds. So what we're doing is trying to improve the ICO ecosystem through the introduction of blockchain-based escrow. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but don't want to monopolize that answer. Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to me because I read a stat, the other day that said there's been $4 billion, I believe, raised through ICOs to date, and 400 million, or 10% of that, has been lost to hackers. So that says a lot to me that there's this new method to raise capital, right? But there's clearly an issue as it relates to some of the things that are diametrically opposed to what Bitcoin was all about, right? The accountability portion is needed for an ICO, right? Especially if the SEC starts implementing regulations that identify it as a security, which I think is coming down the pike, and maybe Mira can speak to that. But all those kinds of things are what people are looking at as they're trying to go through this process of an ICO.
Okay, so I'll answer that question. So yes, so the issue with an ICO is actually, what is it? So you're buying Bitcoin, or you're buying a coin, or also known as a token. So are you buying a security, or is it a currency, or is it just a commodity? And this is, from a legal perspective, the most important question, because if it's a security, then the SEC will go after you, because you cannot just sell securities or offer to sell securities. You have to comply with the Securities Act, and you have to register it before or find an exemption, which usually restricts the ability to just sell to do the ICO. On the other hand, if it's something else, if it's a commodity, then you have a problem with the IRS, because that means you're selling commodity, and you're buying commodity, and once you sell it, you get income, so you'll have to pay tax. And by the way, the IRS said, well, Bitcoins and all those ICOs, these are not currencies. So the IRS actually strictly thinks that we are dealing with commodities, so we have to think about the IRS problem. That's why we have many ICOs that are actually done outside the US, trying to avoid both the IRS and the SEC. Although, of course, if you're selling to US shareholders, you cannot just do it by going to Switzerland, or now, which is more common, is Gibraltar, because Switzerland is also trying to regulate those things. So there is a legal problem here, and about the issues. Okay, so what is it, and the SEC has to decide. The SEC might probably come up with new regulations. Right now, what the SEC is saying, I don't need a new rule, because I already have a rule. I have a test, and those of you who have already taken securities regulations know that this is called the Howey test, and that test just tells you what is a security and what is not a security. And they say we'll take a case-by-case approach, and we'll just see what you're actually selling. If you're selling something that generally we would define it as a security, then you are bound by our rules, and if not, then fine, we don't care. Unless it's fraud, unless it's fraud of what you said before, sort of there's misrepresentation, and a general for the SEC has, especially in Dallas, actually in Texas, the SEC has stopped a few of those ICOs recently. So the question, okay, what are we actually doing here? Is it an ICO that is solely to get a profit without actually doing anything? Which this is really what a security is in a sense. Then the SEC will definitely say that this is a security. So if the idea here is that you're investing in the ICO because you want to get the profits from passively owning the token, the SEC will say, well, that's exactly what I call a security, without going into how we test. Generally, that will fall under their test. On the other hand, if the tokens that you buy in the ICO give you something else, like a service, something like, I would say, something closer to Kickstarter, you can use the program, you can use it to get verification that what you're doing is okay, like your company or some other thing that you're actually participating in the ICO, so later you can use the coin to buy the product that the company will produce later. Then there is some use attached to this token that you purchased in an ICO. Then it's less clear that it's a security. Then you can say, I'm doing it not for the profit of just holding a speculative investment, but actually I'm participating in this token, this new environment in a different way, and that is a commodity.
So if we're talking about these tokens as utility, if there's a function to them, whether that's being able to spend on something, or if it serves some other function like powering the actual technology that's running, how does that technology actually work? So I've heard talk about something called smart contracts. Do you guys have any knowledge about what a smart contract is and how it works, and if there's a legal enforceability around it?
Sure, Brian, maybe.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. Again, we were talking about my definition of blockchain, what it is not. It is not a smart contract. They're different. A smart contract is essentially, from a technology standpoint, if-then statements will lead to execution of that smart contract. Now, it's far more complicated than that, probably even far more complicated than I know at this point. But at the end of the day, people like to talk about blockchain and smart contracts in the same vein, and I don't think that's necessarily accurate. There's companies out there that are using smart contracts to enable them to do additional things, right? So the example that I'll give, which is sort of my background, I cut my chops in the domain name industry and did cyber squatting litigation and represented registrars and registries, and this technology of the smart contract is being deployed by a lot of domain name registrars. I can't tell you exactly which ones, but I can tell you it's a lot, and it's ones that you probably use every day. And they're using it for such things as domain name transactions between buyers and sellers, with escrow companies and otherwise. So I see more on the smart contract side, in my everyday practice. And I also see more on the smart contract side from an enforceability standpoint, which I think was the second part of the question of, well, what happens? Where are these enforced? Are they enforceable? Those issues are starting to be litigated more so than before, and we're starting to see some answers, albeit reverting back to just general contract principles and what is and is not consideration, and whether it was actually executed. That's what I'm seeing on the ground in my space.
Yeah, I think smart contracts are smart contracts are not that smart, first of all. They're not blockchain, although they're a subcategory. And we're building a smart contract in our technology that we're doing right now to basically create blockchain-based escrow services. And I suppose that one thing that's most notable, a smart contract is just simply a coded if this then that. And that's not necessarily new at all. But what's new is that you can, let's say that you had a smart contract 10 years ago, and you were trying to say, if this happens, then money will be released there. If I don't know, you show us a bill of lading, money will be released there, anything. The problem was it involved too much of the offline world. So what smart contracts are doing on the blockchain or on Ethereum most commonly is they are allowing for that entire ecosystem to be done in an automated virtual world. So you can have something that demonstrates something happened without going into the real world. You could have people vote on whether or not the bill of lading was presented. And so the vote on the blockchain is in the code. And then the money transfer, this is the key part of what made smart contracts become so big recently, is before, if you said, okay, then the money moves, well then you had to have some escrow agent or banker say, okay, yeah, let's move that money. And you had to work in a human manual way. But now, because we've got cryptocurrency that can move outside of the banking system based on code, you can have a smart contract say, if this vote happens this way, then the funds will move that way. And it entirely happens based on an automated, encoded mechanism that is outside of the banking system. And sometimes it doesn't even matter if it's within the legal system. If the parties have agreed that this is the way they'll conduct the business, then that's just the way it happens.
Yes, in the sense that the result of what you are both describing here in a smart contract is actually the self-enforcement of the contract, which is ideally where we are heading to with this technology. So the smart contract using this Bitcoin technology and platforms like Ethereum will just have this code, the if-then, as you described, idea. So this code will just automatically enforce the agreement. So to answer your question, Alex, we ideally will need, once it works properly, we will not need legal enforcement because we won't have a breach of contract. Sort of, you are talking about a shipment or any other contract. You don't deliver the consideration. The escrow will not release the consideration on the other side. So it's not just I paid and I didn't receive what I was supposed to receive, but rather the smart contract will automatically keep it in escrow and will wait, and then and it will only execute once it actually verifies both sides. So the idea here is that we're supposed to be using this special technology of the blockchain that is using cryptography, which makes it so secure and verifiable. And that's why we can know for sure that you are the person you identify that you are, or that you claim that you are, and you actually delivered your consideration. And if we get that settled, then we need less and less lawyers litigating about breach of the contract.
So whenever I get an update on my phone for an app or for a game, from time to time there's a bug and the app will crash. With smart contracts, with blockchain stuff, there's no real guarantee that there won't be some sort of bug in the code where something goes wrong. So maybe there's a smart contract where I send you funds, you send me the shipment. What sort of remedy is available when something goes wrong, given that the whole point of this blockchain technology is the decentralization? So in the real world, you can go to a particular person and say, fix this for me. But when it's something decentralized, what recourse do you actually have?
Well, maybe before we talk about recourse, one of the things that I've found so interesting is the new industries that spring up around this whole ecosystem. So one of the things that we've run across recently in all the conferences we've been attending and so forth is the industry of security audits. So anytime you publish your smart contract, it generally goes out to the public for review. And there's several ways that the industry is looking at these smart contracts to make sure that they can rely on them. First of all, there are smart contracts that are not necessarily new. You can just pull them from public available resources. And so then you can see this has been tested with $3 billion worth of transactions. Secondly, they usually go through a security audit process where there's a company, we're working with Hosho Group right now to do our audit of our smart contract. And these companies go through and they review the code in detail. They charge an arm and a leg, and they publish the results and say, hey, this is a solid smart contract. And then third, there's this bounty program that people put out on their own smart contracts. So they'll say, here's $100,000. Anybody that can find a glitch in our code gets the pot. And so they publish that it's been tested by the bounty program, tested by the security audit, and tested by so many X transactions. That's how people start to rely on these smart contracts in volume. But maybe I'll let my colleagues talk about the enforceability of glitches when that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just raised a couple, so if I had my litigator hat on, you just raised a couple people that I think have potential liability, right, or responsibility. One would be obviously the party that is offering whatever it is associated with that smart contract. Two, might be a stretch depending upon the contract language, but the verifying body as well. If they go out and perform this audit and say it's secure and it's something you should be able to use as a user and you don't, I have no problem naming that person as an additional defendant and seeing what shakes out, right? So there's two types of parties that I see potentially being involved in any action to redress an issue. Now, how do you get made whole? Great question, right? I think we're talking a lot here about, we're thinking of US only, but you mentioned Gibraltar, right? It sounds like you're working with companies in this space from all over the world, and the laws are very different all over the world. So then do we revert to, jurisdictional requirements and the rest? A lot of this is, I don't know. And anybody that stands up and purports to know, I don't think they do quite yet because all these things are still being determined. I haven't seen anything definitive on that.
Yeah, there's definitely been cases where you just lose the money. Hey, good luck.
Besides that case, right?
Yeah, I mean, where the parity wallet is the most famous example that jumps to mind for me. Several $100 million were lost in a wallet that was created and reliable, the most reliable multi-sig wallet, if you guys know what that is, out there at the time. And somebody was, the story goes, playing around with the code and just prodding it, somebody very young, and found a glitch, and boom, that money was locked up, and whether they'll ever recover that money, that cryptocurrency, is yet to be determined. People talk about reversing and forking out and all these blockchain concepts, but there's a good chance that in those types of situations, the recourse against whom is tough, and therefore recovery in general is dubious.
And what I don't remember the name of it, but very recently there was a big, I want to say 400 million. There was a large number that was lost, and the offerer of
maybe the Tezos transaction.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Simply said, that's okay. Sorry about that, but we're gonna give you your compensation or the amount that you had in that particular crypto, which to me is just, man, they must be stacking that.
Tezos is not that one. Tezos is one where and it's not due to a glitch in a smart contract, so that's a different story. Where Tezos was an ICO that raised approximately over $200 million, and the money that the team has lost access to the money. The project's frozen up. All the investors are waiting to get their money back, but it's several class action lawsuits. It's a Swiss, American, international transaction. It's chaos, but lawyers are there doing their thing.
So there's the opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of risk involved with these things, with the ICOs and with various transactions going on. Are companies turning towards blockchain and ICOs as a fundraising tool? Are venture capital firms looking to invest in blockchain companies as a new opportunity?
I'll just tell you what I'm seeing. I know there's a family office here in Austin that is solely dedicated to crypto investing. So the short answer is yes. Institutional investors, what they're doing in this space, I think it's no different than any other new technology or new opportunity. They're learning. But I can tell you unequivocally that there is the underlying FOMO, right? Fear of missing out is rampant right now. And I can't tell you how many calls I get a week from either prospective or existing clients that say, I don't know what this is, but I want in, right? Everybody's getting rich off of this, and they're not, right? But that's out there, and that's sort of the dialogue that's happening.
Okay, so yes, there are two issues here that we can a little bit separate. So one is, are VCs actually participating in ICOs? And the other one, are VCs actually participating in companies that use the blockchain technology? And this distinction is very important, right? So, and let me explain why. So just participating in the ICO, it's more of a speculative investment, and yes, there are some VC funds that are doing that. Having said that, this is not what most VC funds are allowed to do. So it's a fund that is supposed to invest in private equity. Some funds also can put a fraction of their funds in other type of investments, which could potentially cover the ICOs. But usually the regular VC fund is actually not allowed to put the money in ICOs. Because what are you getting in the ICO? When you invest in an ICO, you get those coins, those cryptocurrencies, those tokens. It's not equity in a company. A VC investor invests in a company and is supposed to get equity, which comes with also board seats and control over the company. You get none of those when you participate in an ICO. So the documents of the fund usually doesn't allow the VC funds to put too much money in ICOs. On the other hand, all those companies that you have and you're helping start up that are actually using this great technology of the Bitcoin, that Bitcoin uses, of the BitChain, that have the potential to change things that we are doing because of the special security and the decentralizing aspects of it. All those companies might be the new best thing, the new thing, like the new .com and the new internet. So that's why VCs are very focused on that, and there are VCs who specialize in investing in companies that use this technology. But then they might invest in equity. Now, so this is the two distinctions: how they actually invest, how they participate in this market, and can they actually invest. Some VCs actually open new funds to be able to invest in ICOs, because some of those companies, some of those businesses actually that issue ICOs are not necessarily for-profit companies. Ethereum, Bitcoin, they're not for-profit companies, which means the VCs, if they actually just maintain their old model of participating only in for-profit companies for equity, they won't be able to get advantage of this upside of those wonderful coins that are now giving them a lot of profits to other people, very quick profits, and VCs obviously want in this too. Having said all of that, right now, investments in Bitcoin is a fraction, a small fraction of the amount of money that is invested through VC funds. So much more money is still invested the old traditional way. It doesn't mean that it will still be the same in 5 years from now. Probably not. So what is going on now? So the question is also, so suppose I'm a startup and I'm thinking, okay, shall I actually go this ICO route, raise money through ICO, or shall I go and ask and get a VC round? There might be a problem if I try to do one rather than the other. Why? Because ICOs have this bad connotation. You know, this is for the dark web and all those bad uses of the coins. So it might be actually challenging to get VC funding if I started and I got money through ICOs. Of course, if I'm successful, that doesn't matter. If I'm successful, I'll get money either way. And on the other hand, if I cannot get money from VCs, I have another option. I can just raise money through ICOs. So it's a type of crowdfunding that gives me money. In the end of the day, what I think we see, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm at the university, maybe you see different things on the ground that have yet to percolate up, but it seems like ICOs are a substitute usually more of a substitute for angel investments, for the early seed money, and not for the advanced VC money, for now. Whether it will change in the future, that is a question. Whether blockchain technology, which is supposed to, or ideally will disrupt the market and get rid of intermediary, will also actually get rid of VCs, maybe. But then, especially since you have a company like yours that actually helps us check whether it's actually a good investment or not. Because that is what VCs do, right? They don't just put money, they make sure that they're putting money in a good company. And ICOs, you're just putting money and you don't even you just get a white paper. You don't really get much information about what you're investing in. So until you come up with a good solution that vets the companies, we have place for VCs, but maybe in the future actually blockchain will replace VCs. So VCs will have to adapt and participate more in ICOs.
I think capital is a lot less expensive for those people that can do successful ICOs. So if you want to raise money in a VC world, equity, then these VCs are going to be a lot more diligent in their due diligence process. They're going to have a valuation that's more down to earth, etc. I mean, and in an ICO context, you might end up raising 10, 20 times more than you ever could in a VC context. And I think that the number of funds that are coming out there is exploding, who are interested in both the equity and the token side of these people conducting the ICOs. I think that it's been, I think that every other person at a ICO or a blockchain conference that I run into says they're starting a fund. It's amazing how many people are trying to get into the space. But I do think the distinction between the equity side and the token side is interesting, and there's always a shift going on. I think that most of the big funds are very much interested in trying to get on the equity side. Obviously, pre-ICO, if you're going to raise $20 million in an ICO and you just bought in half the company for 2, well then you just turned your 2 into 10 pretty easily. So I think that it's an explosive industry right now in terms of the funds getting into ICOs, either by equity or tokens. It's fascinating to watch, yeah.
So when you go to verify a company, could you actually explain what sort of verification your company puts into place? And on the back end of that, can we talk a little bit about what applications are legitimate for this technology? Like, what do you see on the horizon? You talk about deed registrars, so title transactions being kept on the blockchain, medical records being kept on the blockchain. What sort of do you envision for the future?
Let's see. First of all, we are not certifying or rating different ICOs. We're a self-regulatory organization, so we're a mechanism that an ICO can use to show its credibility by basically saying the funds we raise we won't have access to until we achieve milestones, and the funds will be in an escrow wallet, and then once we achieve those milestones, our backers will vote, confirm the milestone, and the funds will automatically be released according to a smart contract. And so on that basis, we've given leverage and balance back to the investor side. We've encouraged communication between the issuer and the investor side because there's going to be that natural need to get those votes. And so we're a mechanism that allows people to self-regulate, show credibility, reduce risk for their investors. But at the end of the day, we're not doing due diligence on every ICO saying this one's good, this one's bad, this has a rating X, Y, or Z.
So translation from my standpoint is mere service provider, not in line for liability.
Not an investment advisor subject to regulation.
Like a true lawyer.
One of the most interesting parts of doing an ICO is the academic and intellectual challenge of designing tokens. So tokens, as Mira's pointed out, are different for every ICO. No ICO has the same token. So when the SEC comes down and says this, well, that doesn't necessarily mean what this token is. So it's going to take a long time to sort out exactly where we have a security and where we don't. But as more opinions come out, it'll become more and more clear. What's really cool is everyone designs their own token. Everyone applies these concepts of economics, tokenomics it's called, to their token to decide where are the supply, demand, and pressure points. And everyone then filters that through a regulatory component. Oh, what have I done in terms of my token? Have I created financial institution liability? Am I custodian? Am I a gambling token? Am I whatever? And so you have to apply the regulatory regime according to your sector. And it's a fascinating process of creating a token. Whereas before we had these just equity stakes, that was that. Yeah, you could tweak it here and there and have a preferred kind of concept, etc. But now we've got these tokens and these ways of raising funds that completely allow you to think out the box and outside of the box and do a lot more with raises, equity raises, even with tokens. And I think the second part of your question is what am I most excited about the future of blockchain in the near future, the application, is just the tokenization process, the securitization process of assets, of projects, the way that you can now much more democratically access investors and backers of projects through a tokenization event is going to be applied in so many areas, whether you're talking about building out a real estate project or you're talking about intellectual property, the tokenization of a museum's artwork. It's really, to me, exciting about that tokenization process.
And I'll piggyback off the tokenization aspect. You guys should check out Kodak's an example of what they're doing. They've created this Kodak One, which is their technology that allows for rules around image rights transfer. And then they created a coin that goes with it. I believe it's called Kodak Coin. With, again, they set the parameters for what they want the token to be. So I'm excited about seeing those kinds of institutional companies create and leverage technology. And I'm equally excited, especially on the startup side. I represent a ton of startups. These startups getting into the space, and it may not be as technical as some of the others. So there's people out there that their sole business offering right now is going and finding real estate space for these mining rigs, which are essentially server racks, right? And servers to allow all of the mining that's being done on Bitcoin and some of these others, right? The amount of calls and ideas that are out there around this technology to me is just, it's fascinating.
Yeah, so let me add also that very established big companies participate in that, like Oracle and IBM, they all have, they sell actually products that have to do with the technology that's behind the coins. They're not necessarily selling tokens yet, but they are selling software that enables others to create those type of startups. So it does have the potential to change a lot of things. And I'm also very excited about the security aspect of this technology and how that is going to potentially change how we do finances and other things like health insurance.
And just I don't want to get too granular, but another example that I'm seeing, a lot of smoke around is, for example, the trademark, United States Patent and Trademark Office, right? When a mark is transferred, the assignments have to be filed, and then as part of the M&A due diligence and a transaction, it's been someone's role oftentimes that they go back and they trace the chain of title and make sure that it's actually owned by the person that's assigning it to them. Well, there's a lot of blockchain technology out there that will automatically verify that and allow you to go look at the ledger and see, was it transferred the way that you thought it was? So, what does that mean? That means from a lawyer standpoint, some of our jobs get a little bit easier potentially. From a client standpoint, potentially a little bit cheaper, right? So all those kinds of ramifications based upon what's going on, it's industry agnostic, right? I'm just seeing in the legal space, and we're here talking from the legal standpoint, but it's everywhere.
I suppose if I were to make a prediction on where we would see the first widespread application of blockchain used by enterprise, it would be in the loyalty sphere. So right now we already have this concept of points and so forth. That's not new. Once you can put it on the blockchain, it becomes a lot more dynamic, transparent, and liquidity of these points becomes a lot bigger. So I think that I can't imagine that there's a major loyalty program on the planet that isn't heavily looking at blockchain, and I would imagine that that'll be the first area where we might not even know we're using blockchain, but we're trading our points, which are basically tokens on the blockchain.
Interesting. All right, so it's been a very riveting discussion. There's a lot to take in, but with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions anyone has who's been holding them back. All right, let's start up there. Okay.
I had a couple comments. First on securitization of points. I worked as a pre-ICO consultant last semester for this airline that was looking into turning their airline miles into these tokens that could be traded for other things. I thought that was really fascinating, but I want the legal perspective in that I think blockchain is actually going to make the legal stuff way more important. So once I start a startup and I sign on this due diligence, my partners don't really read any of that stuff. But if that's instantiated in software-based governance, that stuff is really important now. So now I need to know all the bounds of it and where it's going to break. So I think the legal minds are, I think there's going to be a lot of demand for legal minds. You might not need the verification of I went to this law school, but if you can instantiate governance on a software, on a blockchain or whatever, I think we could increase demand for law perspectives. I'm wondering your guys' opinion on that.
I suppose that from a legal demand perspective, I think there's going to definitely a peak where you try to move things from the offline world to the blockchain world. So if you're creating an instrument for the first time that's recognized as legally enforceable, trust instrument, some other instrument, that's going to require a whole lot of heavy digging and so forth in terms of how to create it for the first time. But then once you've created that instrument that's been tested and is out there, it becomes a whole lot more scalable than anything before. If you wanted to create a trust instrument before, you needed to still go into an office and hire a lawyer. So I think that I envision a peak in terms of moving these things into a more scalable model, and after which I would envision there'd be less demand for lawyers once you've got a proven, tested mechanism built on a scalable smart contract. Just my thought.
I wouldn't drop out quite yet. There's going to be plenty of opportunity out there for you. I tend to agree. I think it's like anything else, right? As these things are being figured out on the front end, inevitably lawyers are more involved at that point. But do I see a world where smart contracts are going to replace, the need for you to contact, your local single lawyer hanging his own shingle to get a contract done? I do. I absolutely do. When? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I think you have some time.
Yeah, I guess today you could go online and download a simple contract just as a platform, just as a sample, and yet we don't have fewer lawyers just because we do that. You can usually also download a startup kit for starting a VC-backed company, so a startup from the internet, and yet that doesn't mean that we have less work as lawyers in that area. So I think it will just shift, and I think you're absolutely right, because somebody has to review all those smart contracts before they are being coded. So maybe it will actually increase, but then who can predict?
I think AI is an area where we might be talking about that question a little bit differently. Yeah, but this is a blockchain panel.
You had a question?
Yeah, I think you already mentioned the CFTC and ACC stuff that came out last week, and basically the concept is just enforce the laws we already have with regard to securities law and so forth. I guess wanted to kind of throw it over to Brian, maybe that Brian, kind of leading more on what you're seeing in contract law, or agree with you, but is that sort of your general sense too now, that there's just so much work to basically just enforce existing legal precedent within these systems, or is there a dearth of new law and just unknowns at sort of the on the legal side? I guess, where do you see that line?
I think it's early, so as a result of that, it's relying upon, you know, your traditional legal principles, right? I equate it to, you know, the internet law space, right? So a decade ago, I think they were calling it cyber law, right? Cyber lawyers. And then it transitioned to internet law and internet lawyers, and obviously things were put in place geared specifically to the technology, right? The Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Things along those lines. I haven't seen per se any new laws dedicated and directed solely to blockchain or how to interpret a smart contract, right? My guess is it's going to be pulling upon and drawing upon, you know, various laws that already exist until we see more issues that then force legislation to come into play to address it.
You know, I think that, again, we need to think globally when we're talking about blockchain, and there's a real competitive landscape out there of countries around the world that are being progressive with respect to recognizing blockchain as a legally, and smart contracts as legally enforceable. So there are countries out there that are doing great experiments, whether it be Estonia or Singapore, Switzerland, are doing some really progressive things in terms of applying blockchain for title registry or smart contracts. And even Delaware has made some big progress, I think, in that respect.
So then, you know, it raises questions of forum shopping in this space, right? Like, well, what does that look like? I know you mentioned Gibraltar, right? Gibraltar is putting together what they're claiming to be the first, universally acceptable registration requirements and items associated with an ICO, right?
I was on the phone this morning with a potential client in Germany who's doing an ICO and was put off by the idea that Germany required you to register and get approval before you did their ICO. So they're jurisdiction shopping.
Yeah.
And we were talking Isle of Man and Gibraltar this morning, and they said, well, that's out because of Brexit. So we got an interesting ecosystem.
Yeah, and of course we have countries that are reacting in the opposite direction, like Switzerland, that used to be the old Gibraltar, who say, no, don't do it here anymore, so they added regulations that prevent ICOs to be so lucrative. Or even Canada, I think I read that they want Google to stop all the ads that are related to ICOs, right? I don't see the US actually going that way, but that's what we have China that is blocking it, and then we have Gibraltar and Estonia and other places where they're actually encouraging that. Keeping in mind the fact that if you are selling securities to a US person, it doesn't matter where you're doing it, you're still subject to US laws. So there's, you can run, but it's hard to hide, except if you really believe that it's not a security, it's a commodity. So the IRS maybe depends on the rules.
Just real quick, that's a great point on the IRS front, right? I mean, I don't know if there's official guidelines at this point, but how it's been interpreted from a tax standpoint, capital asset versus not, right? So those things are happening, which what does that lead to? It creates opportunity for lawyers, accountants, and the others to make sure they're following these bouncing balls and can advise clients that are making the calls and asking those questions.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Can you touch on the healthcare aspects of blockchain and for more so for information transfer, for prescription verification, or healthcare information transfers?
The first thing that jumps to mind for me is the basic concept of people owning their own data again. So the world that we live in is such that we don't own so much of our own data. Blockchain will allow us to hold that data and decide when we want to sell it. There'll be all kinds of people in the medical space who want to get access to your data, whether you're wearing your Fitbit and you've got that data or what. You can then start to monetize your data. You can decide who has it, who doesn't. So that's all, there are people here in Austin that are building those platforms today. So I see it all about data, controlling data and monetizing your own data is really the near future of how I see blockchain affecting things.
And the security aspect of it. Right, so because it's decentralized and secured, so everybody can access it, but nobody can actually know who you are. In that sense, it's more secure because they have to hack your particular computer to find information about you, as opposed to now where all this information is centralized on the computers of sort of one hospital or one healthcare provider, and if the hacker goes after that one computer, they get all the information of all the patients, which is much more dangerous and sort of riskier for us, the patients.
Do any of you see, moving forward, given that there might be a tokenization of everything, technology is moving in this very fast pace, for attorneys to be aware of how the technology is actually running on a case-by-case basis? Do you, like to Enrique's point, where people might have to review the smart contract and make sure that it's doing the things that they agreed to verbally? Do you see a need coming for technologically savvy attorneys to be in every practice?
I think that it's like so many other technologies. I don't think you have to have a PhD in biotechnology to advise in that field, but it certainly helps to have a depth of knowledge in biotechnology. And so I think that you don't have to know how to code, but you have to know the basic principles of a smart contract in order to really start advising in that space. So I'd say that there's some additional knowledge needed, but not, I don't think lawyers need to become coders.
Yeah, and I can also, if I could quickly add on that, in addition to smart contracts, we also see new regular contracts, like the theft, right, in the VC area, right? So we have new types of regular contracts just because of this new technology. So definitely there is more place for innovation and for lawyers.
I want to make a comment, like whenever you do push out an actual smart contract and say you have a function in your smart contract, if other smart contracts that exist on the blockchain call that function, you don't push your function twice, you just point to that one. So from a lawyer perspective, if I'm trying to set this case and I'm basing my case on this president, I don't have to push this president anymore, I just point to that president. So there's like a parallel there, and that helps like minimize the amount of stuff we're actually pushing on the blockchain. And what you actually have on the blockchain is a minimum amount of different functions you need to run all the different smart contracts you could want. So I think we're going to see a lot of parallels, like, oh, how can we reduce some frictions that exist in the non-blockchain world based on what we learned in the blockchain world.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I perhaps touched on that a bit earlier. I agree with what you're saying, that as much as possible, people are using tested smart contracts and incorporating them in. So much of it is open source. So you can incorporate in, I mean, what we're building today is mostly tested code that is then being kind of parsed together via our own development team. But as much as possible, everyone's trying to piggyback off of tested smart contracts. And so I think that same concept of precedent and tested technology have a lot of overlap.
Okay, any further questions? Anybody? All right, let's give a round of applause for our